Okay, welcome everybody. I'm probably the third or fourth person who's welcomed you to 2021 reInvent. Sorry, let me put this off. I'll do it again anyway. So welcome to reInvent 2021. I'm very pleased today to have you all here for this session on Olive and how Olive is working to improve the human experience in healthcare. My name is Joe Schunkweiler. I'm a physician by training, and I'm now part of the healthcare and life science startup business development team at AWS. And as someone who's spent their whole life in and around medicine, I really can't think of anything more motivating and inspiring than the mission of using technology to humanize the healthcare experience, and that's exactly what Olive is trying to do. I'm going to turn this over to Rohan in a few minutes, but I want to start by providing just a little background on an initiative that we're really excited about here at AWS. So we all know that healthcare organizations are moving towards a digital transformation. And there's a variety of reasons to do that. They want to improve collaboration, they want to make more data-driven decisions, and they want to accelerate the trend toward personalized approaches to care, patient-centric care. But in doing that, identifying the right cloud technology is a challenge. We all know that. So to help customers accelerate that process, we announced AWS for Health over this summer. AWS for Health is an offering of AWS services and AWS partner network solutions to help organizations increase their pace of innovation, to unlock the potential of healthcare data, which we know is so rich, and also to develop more streamlined approaches to that patient-centric care that everybody is trying to achieve. So how do you do that? So AWS for Health aligns these purpose-built services within AWS with partner solutions, AWS partner network solutions, across 6 crucial areas for healthcare organizations. Industry customers can then more easily identify the right cloud technology to achieve their business goals in the most efficient way possible. That's a great segue, which is not surprising because I designed it that way. That's a great segue into Olive and what Rohan's going to talk to us a bit about today. They're creating what they like to call the Internet of Healthcare, which you're going to hear a lot more about, to revolutionize how healthcare information is shared, deployed, optimized. These are tough challenges, and they're tackling them head on. It's a particular pleasure to share the stage today with Rohan D'Souza, the Chief Product Officer from Olive. So just some background on Rohan. Rohan is a medical technology trailblazer, and I don't use that term lightly. He joined Olive from a company called Kensai, where he drove innovation and product strategy for machine learning solutions. Before joining Kensai, Rohan was instrumental in building an industry-leading population health platform at eClinicalWorks. I think one of the coolest things, he's also a leading voice for the Open Health Data Initiative. And part of that process is pushing electronic medical record systems, to adopt open API frameworks for healthcare interoperability. So Olive is a company that's tackling some of the toughest challenges, and Rohan is a key part of that team that's instrumental in doing that. So very pleased to turn the stage over to Rohan D'Souza.
All right. It is very surreal to be in front of people again and speaking at a conference. I'm used to imagining things in tiles and people sitting on a Zoom screen. So thank you for this opportunity, Joe, and thank you, AWS, for allowing me the opportunity to come and present on a topic that I think is extremely important for all of us in society to care about. Healthcare is one of the few places, I think, as technologists, we have this amazing opportunity and responsibility where what we do in our 9 to 5 can impact our 5 to 9. There's not that many verticals and spaces in technology where you get to work on things that are incredibly meaningful but have an insane amount of responsibility because it could impact your life every single day and your loved ones and people that you care about and people that you work with. So We start off with every conversation by saying healthcare really, really needs the internet. And by way of background, as Joe mentioned, my name is Rohan D'Souza. I am Chief Product Officer of Olive. Got a lot of questions coming in and saying, who is Olive? What is Olive? To pad up our census, I asked people to come in and sit in, so thank you for those who took my request and actually came into the room. But Olive is a company that is focused on building out what we call as the Internet of Healthcare. So what does that specifically mean, and why do we care so much about it? So first thing that I'd like to start off with is to give you all some context. And that context is healthcare has a human problem. And what do I mean by that, and what do hundreds of Olivians mean by that? What we mean by healthcare having a human problem is we as a society, both on the delivery of medicine, the consumption of medicine, and in the payment of medicine, have unfortunately done a disservice by using humans as routers to compensate for the lack of systems talking to each other. There haven't, unfortunately, been incentives to allow for technology to work for humans versus getting humans to work for technology. And that is what we are deeply rooted in, and that is what we care about when we say that we're building out the Internet of Healthcare. Some stats just to highlight this problem and how widespread and large and crushing it is on our economy. Is if you take a couple of these numbers and put it into perspective, roughly on average, there's about 16 million human workers that are working in healthcare today. You can read any report that will tell you the US spends about 18% of its GDP on healthcare. The next closest country is about 8%. And that number, 18%, is continuing to rise. It's actually not being bent in a curve that is favorable for us as a society to benefit from. Life expectancy has not increased at the rate of the expenditure in healthcare. And we have solved the lack of system integration by putting people in the mix, every single deterministic task that is performed in healthcare. 4 million of those 16 million are estimated to be what are considered human routers. And these are classic high velocity, very low variability items. Take, for example, if you go into a provider's office, the first thing you're mostly greeted with is something that will remind you from an old PE class, and that's a clipboard and a pen in today's day and age. Right? You really don't see a clipboard and pen almost anywhere today, but you're almost guaranteed to see it when you go into a doctor's office. Another thing that you will see is a machine that is usually sitting on the side of a doctor's office or in a registration office that has the dreaded 3-letter word called FAX, or fax. Fax is only heard of, unfortunately for us, in healthcare. While today I can reserve a car to come pick me up instantaneously with some APIs that are exposed in an experience that's extremely delightful, but I can't communicate with my provider's office when I have to move cities or when I have to move locations and I get a massive PDF file sent to me in the form of a fax machine. And so what healthcare has done is it has put humans into this particular process to solve for the lack of system integration. And finally, those 4 million human routers are spending about 8.6 billion hours of rote tasks that could essentially be augmented and automated with technology. And so we deeply believe that healthcare deserves this true innovation that connects all of its disconnected, disparate systems and provides this unparalleled intelligence for today's unprecedented demands. And the unprecedented demands are the thing that we're going through right now, a global pandemic that has changed the way we communicate and interact with a system that is so fragile, the healthcare system. Every single one of us today are probably walking around with a little white card proving our vaccine status. And if you lose that card, it could really prevent you from entering your favorite restaurant, right? It's kind of crazy that we're living in this world and we're set out to solve some of those challenges incrementally. And so what we then go on to say is that healthcare cannot sustain this level and accept this status quo. There has to be individuals that are challenging the status quo in order to allow the system to survive and eventually thrive. We're a nation and we're a society that has incredible innovation, and we have to put some of that effort now towards healthcare. So this is my call to everybody. As you're looking at your next frontier, please consider health. The fact that we're talking about healthcare at an AWS conference itself is quite humbling. So it's great to see that. A couple more things I want to present to you just to contextualize this further is when you think about the 18% of GDP, skeptics will say, well, Rohan, a lot of that money is being put towards drug discovery, facilities, new technology, et cetera, et cetera. But if you really think about it, administrative costs of that 18% are accounting for at least 1/4 to 1/3 of the total US spending on health. And if I was to connect this to something that is likely near and dear to any one of us around chronic diseases, is that amount being spent on administrative burden is twice what the US spends on caring for cardiovascular disease and 3 times what it spends on cancer care. So if you let that sink in for a moment and try to tackle the root of the problem and not go after the symptom, if we are able to carve out and put a dent into this administrative cost burden that is happening in healthcare and to repurpose those dollars towards things like solving for complex cardiovascular care and cancer care and various other diseases, I feel like we will leave our future generations in a much better place than it was handed to us. And that is what Olive is set out on doing. So some history about Olive. We are headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, but we got a Columbus fan in the house. Beautiful Midwest city. I live in Seattle, Washington, but fellow Seattle fan. Can't be too far from Seattle at an AWS conference, and we've been in business since 2012. This year, we're a little over 1,300 people distributed across what we call the grid. The grid is a working model where Olivians anywhere in the United States can get on the grid and work to solve healthcare's toughest problems and build the Internet of Healthcare. We originally started off by building identity verification and security and patient privacy solutions before we moved into the space of automation in healthcare. We're big fans of AWS. We are built mostly on PaaS services that are offered through the AWS standard offering, the AWS platform offering, and we continue to mature our AWS offering, starting off just like everybody else on EC2 and S3 instances, and now eventually using across the board asynchronous activities with Lambda functions and SQS and Kinesis and the whole kit and caboodle of what AWS offers. And obviously, as a reminder, we are building the Internet of Healthcare. So what do we mean by building the Internet of Healthcare? We are typically categorized by the industry as a robotic process automation company. And blame the industry experts for that categorization because they have to put us in somewhere. There is no category called the Internet of Healthcare. So you'll often hear Olive is a robotic process automation company for healthcare. Today, my job is to tell you how we're so much more than just robotic process automation and why we're taking automation to a much higher elevation. The reason why we say building the Internet of Healthcare is we have taken the concepts of automation and contextualized it for healthcare. And what do I mean by that? We have contextualized it for healthcare by embedding contextual information into software robots, more specifically, who are connected behind the scenes through a mesh network. So when one Olive learns, every single Olives learn, which means Olive is always talking to her friends that are working in the trenches of healthcare across many different health systems, provider organizations and payer organizations, and is informing each of our friends that I'm noticing something that is happening across the system. Are you seeing the same thing? Here's the alteration that I made in a particular process. Go ahead and make that change. And that's the difference between building the internet of healthcare versus having the intranet of healthcare. And so a little bit more tactical, what did we end up doing? And how did we bring Olive to life? So we built a technology platform, a central enterprise automation platform, which has the ability for, or provides the ability for Olive to manifest in various different ways. One way that Olive manifests is in the form of an AI worker. And an AI worker is your classic behind-the-scenes batch-based operations that are rote operations that are hundreds and thousands across healthcare systems. The ability to send a message between a provider to a patient, the ability to check the status of a claim when a visit is completed in order to see if that claim is going to be paid, the ability to check if this patient has the appropriate eligibility before a service is rendered, or the ability for a system to communicate with another system. This is classic tasks that Olive performs behind the scenes without a human in the loop. There are certain scenarios where Olive is required to sit side by a human. And so as part of the digital AI workforce, we created a coworker. So we have Olive manifesting side by side with a human that recognizes and identifies the task that a human is performing, highly contextualized. These are situations where traditional batch-based automation just does not work. Take, for example, a call center. When a call request comes in and a patient is requesting for an appointment with their provider, Olive knows the likes and dislikes of that particular patient and the subtle nuances of the provider. Provider happens to live in this part of the state and likes to play golf on Thursdays at 5 p.m. So if you're booking an appointment, just know you don't want to book an appointment for 4:30 or 4:45 because you're either going to have a really upset patient who's going to have to be rushed through their appointment or a really upset provider who can't make a meeting. And so Olive presents that information highly contextualized within the workforce as an example. Another use case might be in patient access. When a patient comes in and the system, the person registering the patient doesn't ask the patient, has anything changed with your address, your insurance? Olive knows that information has changed and presents the information in real time to the provider that is registering the patient to let them know, and that's in a coworker setting. So that's the manifestation of Olive in various different avatars built on top of this enterprise platform. So as technologists, we often find ourselves taking nouns and converting them into verbs. So it's important to think about robotic process automation, and AI is definitely going through a moment right now. It's a hotly talked about item. You can't go too far today without talking about AI or machine learning or automation. And so I'd like to just spend some time a little bit and walk you through what is our inspiration and rooting in automation. So if you're a purist about automation and we stick with the noun is the technique of making an apparatus, a process, or a system operate automatically. And throughout history, we have had various different ways that humans have applied automation to get us to a point where we can make it ubiquitous and contextualize it in healthcare. All the way back from the first pieces of automation that have inspired how we keep time, to the Industrial Revolution that has led to the computing age to get us to this point today of being in the era of artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence, if I was to give you a true reflection of what is happening in healthcare, it is going through a moment of being highly bastardized and diluted. There's so much under the bucket of artificial intelligence where it's extremely confusing, right? People are saying, is this AI, when it might just be if, then, else statements. So you have to really think about how much of a purist around AI do you want to be, and I'm here today to prove to you why I think automation sits within the function and coexistence of the field of AI. So a couple more stats. By 2030, McKinsey believes that AI alone will be a $13 trillion vertical to the entire global economy. There's a couple places of application. Again, this is highly contextualized for healthcare. This is analyzing massive amounts of unstructured data, identifies patterns and automation opportunity. Healthcare has a tremendous amount of unstructured data. The most structured data that exists today in healthcare is what you end up seeing forced through a claim transaction. But the actual value of a clinical note and the clinical context, and even in a phone call, is extremely unstructured. And so there's AI-based technologies and automation, both that we're doing at Olive and other companies are investing in to solve this particular problem so we can allow providers and clinicians to do what they always wanted to do, which is care for patients and not work for a computer system. Second is the ability to mimic human logic. Again, in healthcare, it is a field of subject matter expertise that comes with years and years and years of experience. Automation today is challenging some of those status quos. AI is challenging some of those status quos because it is presenting identifiable, interpretable model results that might challenge the way you deliver medicine today. And so we're going through this process right now where how much of human logic needs to be accounted for when you're building out AI-based processes that is applied within automation workflows. And finally, no system is complete without a loop and the ability to learn and continue to recommend. Healthcare has another concept called the learning health system. Health systems have instituted processes and protocols for them to continuously learn. There are governance models, there are committees that are established to continue to have the system learn from the data that they capture. And we're getting to this point where the people sitting in those governance and recommendation systems might not be in flesh, might not be in bone and flesh. It might be a computer system that is assisting and augmenting the continuous learning and recommendation. And so with everything on this journey towards AI and automation, systems will go through a process of evolution. And so we at Olive think of that as the 4 pillars to technology around intelligent automation. Most of the time, you will start your journey around automation with what is traditionally called UI-based robotic process automation. And so if I take you down a little bit of a history lesson in healthcare investments, healthcare can be broken up in about 2 or 3 decades. If Gartner was to write a report on this, they'll call it the 3 Gartner hype cycles of healthcare investments. The first was a decade of investments in systems of record. The federal government helped with this through the use of incentive dollars. Billions of dollars were poured in, where in the late 90s to the early 2000s, we only had about 4% of our systems digitalized. 96% of it was still on paper. And then you had events like Hurricane Katrina come and completely wipe out thousands and millions of people's medical records because they were in manila folders locked up in doctors' offices. So we incentivize providers and systems to invest in systems of record. What we didn't do as part of that process is incentivize those systems to talk to each other. So what ended up happening is we created these massive towers in data silos that came as part of the investment of system of record. We then started to believe that we're in the business of consumers. Healthcare is a consumerization business. We are in the business of serving care to consumers. And so we got into the next phase of investment, which was systems of engagement. And you started to see companies, big companies, put in dollars into building out portals and messaging systems and consumerize the experience of healthcare. And then finally, because we saw both of these areas not connected to each other, we invested in something called systems of interoperability. And now we have federal rules in place that mandate these systems of record to talk to each other and the systems of record to talk to the systems of engagement. We're now in the age of what I believe is to be the next decade of the investment around systems of intelligence. And this is the unlock of the data, the integration, the engagement systems that have already been put in place. And one place to start is UI-based robotic process automation. And this is classic, having Olive log into a virtual machine, maybe an ephemeral VM, signs in into an application, is logged into the application, performs a particular task, completes the task, logs out, and the VM is shut down. Those are some examples of UI-based robotic process automation. It's fairly easy and commoditized at this point to do. The next thing that we end up doing with automation is to take advantage of these APIs that are being exposed. Healthcare is all abuzz right now with an API framework called FHIR. AWS provides it as a first-party application within the vertical stack. And you can use full read capabilities against these systems of records to build out automation workflows. Unfortunately, the write-back capability associated with these APIs aren't at the same level of the read capabilities. So you can do a lot of stuff around data extraction, but when it comes to going in and modifying certain fields, you're limited by what the provider on the system side offers you as a developer or a vendor to do. So there's a combination now of API-based robotic process automation and UI-based robotic process automation. A third area that we as a company are investing in is cybernetics. Cybernetics is not talked about too much, but has been studied for many, many decades. And it's the application of system routing and to go from point A to point B in the most efficient path. And the way we've done that is through our AI coworker technology. We've embedded cybernetics technology through loops, which are synonymous for apps that are embedded directly at the point of care, at the point of application, with a supporting SDK that developers can build on, because healthcare is enormous. And we don't want to be in a situation where all of the applications to solve healthcare's biggest problems are being built by Olive. And finally is the embedding of artificial intelligence, the ability to do things like clinical NLP when Olive logs into an application to extract a clinical note, to then use an API to extract a clinical bundle, to then use cybernetics to let the user know that an insurance company is requiring an authorization, to then use AI to tell the user that your clinical documentation checks out and your authorization is going to be approved in real time. That is the coming together of all of the 4 pillars associated with automation, and which is why Olive is not a robotic process automation company. It is a true end-to-end automation company, and why we believe it is an umbrella term that the industry is going to start to recognize. So this is mostly rooted in the IHI Triple Aim, which is now the IHI Quadruple Aim. Everything that is done in healthcare is looked through 4 key metrics. The ability to control costs, the ability to ensure that you have an excellent experience for a consumer, the ability to ensure that the quality of care being delivered isn't compromised, and the 4th one, which is the 3rd one on this screen, is to ensure that we are always being empathetic to the human and the human worker, and to avoid burnout. Burnout is a very big issue. There's lots of talk today about the Great Resignation. Healthcare has been having this for many, many years. We have a massive nurse shortage today in this country. We have providers that are working 18 hours just charting. We have providers sitting by a fax machine and looking at documents which could easily be transferred electronically, leading to a massive, massive amount of burnout. And that's why I said we have a huge responsibility to our system. So get a little bit technical now for a few minutes is how are we working with AWS and how have we built this enterprise platform? So we took inspiration from the human body when we thought about our platform. And we spent some time really thinking about how do we go away from monoliths and how can we build a flexible, scalable microservice architecture that allows us to scale infinitely without having to take every single permutation and combination into forecasting what our workloads are going to be. And so we took inspiration from specifically neuron stem cells and the nervous system to architect our microservice platform. So essentially what we've done is we've taken a bunch of native AWS services. Olive manages this completely reactive nanoservice architecture using Lambdas, SNS, Amazon SQS, along with a robust, massive data lake infrastructure streamlining interfaces for the 3 Ps that we interact with, which is the providers, the patients, and the payers. We obviously leverage Lambdas and Kinesis to provide streams, and we essentially take a data topic, we convert it into an event stream. Every single neuron has one and only one task. It performs that specific task that it is meant to perform consistently, and it passes that on through the synapse off to the next task that will take this end-to-end deterministic solution and provide a sub-second response back in order to build out behind the scenes this Internet of Healthcare. And we are a big knowledge graph and graph shop. We really nerd out on knowledge graphs. I think healthcare has a excellent use case of the application of knowledge graphs in application. And so what we've done at Olive is we've built this graph in motion where every little neuron and every little graph that is created that is highly contextualized for that specific entity, whether it's a patient, whether it's a provider, whether it's a single claim, whether it's a single episode, embedded with all of this information, always has a connectivity back to our centralized knowledge graph. And this allows us to do the things that we say that we do when one olive learns, all olives learn. AWS and the services that are provided both natively as PaaS services, or in our case, we have to provide some amount of hybrid architecture because most of our systems of record in healthcare today do not run natively in the cloud. They can only run in traditional server-based or Citrix-based deployments. So we do have to have some of our payload running in a non-cloud native function directly on-prem. And so our graph is always getting updated both at the edge and centralized within our central knowledge graph. And putting all of this together is to tie this in finally into a use case. So if you are in healthcare, you probably know the massive challenge with prior authorizations. It is the way that insurance companies believe to control spend and gross misuse of services. Unfortunately, it has put a tremendous amount of pressure on the administrative side of healthcare. So some estimates value that $400 billion alone is spent on these processes like billing and non-clinical related spaces. Prior authorizations, as an example, alone is about $135 billion removal of waste or cost from the system. Technology is there today to completely automate this process end to end. It's just where you want to start and how far do you want to go. And so at Olive, what we've done is everything that I've shown you from an architecture standpoint, we have created these end-to-end solutions that are built on top of our core platform. This is one example of a solution that is built on the platform. There are many others that are applied in various different fields. So what we do at Olive is the first thing that we do is we use RPA technology to ensure that we build out an extremely rich database of content. Healthcare is very rich in content. Unfortunately, the content is highly distributed. And so at any given period of time, if you are a health system or if you are a patient interacting with a health system, the person on the receiving end of the system does not know what are the rules associated with the plan that you have. And so they end up spending a tremendous amount of time searching for the data associated with the plan in order to define what needs to be done in order to get this authorization. So the first thing that we do is we retrieve over 40,000 medical necessity rules from national, regional, and state payers. America is mostly a system of 3 large categories of payers. You have a federally funded health plan in the form of Medicare. You have a state-funded health plans in the form of Medicaid. You have a privatized insurance market, which is all of the various different insurance plans that are then broken out based on region or national. And then, of course, your third largest payer is self-pay. So people who are uninsured or people who wish to pay out of pocket. In situations where you are in a commercial plan, you have to follow this process of utilization management. So the first thing that we do is we use RPA technology to check for eligibility, and to check if a prior authorization is needed. We then kick into gear and we engage a set of predictive models, a combination of heuristics-based and neural nets that will do clinical extraction associated with the bundles of data and documents that Olive will extract from a system of record. And so all of this data, the training and the scoring is all running in our cloud environment and exposed via APIs for others to tap into. And so we do a medical necessity check, we submit the clinical documents, we assemble the document. At any given period of time, a single prior authorization request could have up to 800 documents for one single patient. And so what Olive does is it sifts through all of those documents and it decides which document to submit to the health plan. Once the prior authorization is submitted, you can't let your foot off the gas because an authorization is approved for a very specific service. But because things are stochastic in healthcare, when the patient actually comes in for the service, a provider might change the code that was actually approved through the prior authorization process. So we once again use RPA to continue to check the status and to inform the provider through cybernetics and through loops to say, you're using a code, a combination of a diagnosis code or a procedure code, that's actually not the code that was approved by the insurance company. So you stand to potentially have your case denied because the authorization that you asked for was, let's say, an MRI without contrast, but you've changed it to an MRI with contrast. And so Olive knows that because of all of the intelligence at the edge and the ability to constantly communicate leveraging this various technology. We then monitor the entire auth process because an authorization might be approved for a period of time. As an example, my daughter, her first year and a half of life, had a milk protein allergy. And we had an authorization for 1 year to use a very specific type of formula that was approved by the insurance company. And so that approval process had to continue to stay up to date and stay in check because the insurance company is requesting for data constantly from the provider, which is putting pressure on the administrative side to do faxes, which can now be offset to somebody like Olive, who is embedded inside of the health system to perform those particular tasks. And so hopefully this gives you a perspective of the actual application of how we at Olive are building the Internet of Healthcare, leveraging automation, embedding AI into our RPA process, into our overall automation process, and eventually tying it in with a cybernetics delivery at the point of care to be empathetic and be emotional associated with the human. We take a lot of inspiration from people like Kai-Fu Lee, who said, AI can exist with humans in very specific tasks as long as we're augmenting and we're empathetic. And healthcare deserves that. So the cost of the false positive is way too high in healthcare to say I accidentally made this recommendation and somebody took action on it. So with that, I think we are at the end. And Joe's going to round us out with a message, and then we'll open it up for questions. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So, we do have some time for questions, but before we get to that, I wanted to first thank Rohan for your time and for walking us through that and how Olive is tackling those huge challenges, as you can tell, in such a thoughtful and impactful way. But also, I wanted to invite you all to join us at the networking lounge every day after the speakers, in between sessions, whatever that is. We have an Ask the Expert session, and you can meet other folks from the healthcare and life science team. It's on the Wynn Level 1, and it's labeled the Healthcare and Life Science Lounge. You'll see other lounges out here in the hallway, and it looks a lot like that. So with that, I would love to open it up to any questions you have for Rohan or anything else that we talked about today with AWS for Health or anything like that we can answer. So any questions? Yep.
Yeah. Good question. So I will try to answer it to the best of my capabilities. Yes, Epic and Cerner and other large system of record implementations are extremely costly to a health system. An Amazon model would say it's a one-way door decision, likely, because it's a tremendous investment that gets put in. And there's a lot of standardization that is required in order to truly get value from those systems that are being implemented. The challenge is the best practice guides are constantly evolving because healthcare is such a community. It's such a community event. It's important. What is important for one community is very different. Greenville Health System, now GHS is now a different name, I think. They are going to leverage an out-of-the-box solution and try to their best of their abilities to fit the best practice guides, but would be challenged. And so you run into these situations where you have square peg, round hole. And you have to ask yourself, do I continue to bet on a system that my board and everybody has committed to, or can I augment it with supporting systems in place? I think that's a role and a niche where we come in, we wedge in, and we say we really don't care much about the standardization or the lack of standardization that you have, because Olive is a constantly evolving. We don't compete with a system of record. In fact, we're thankful that a system of record exists, something like Epic or Cerner, to allow Olive to do her work. The second part of your question was around the staff cuts and labor arbitrage and the belief that the system of record is the silver bullet that will solve all the problems. I don't have a solution to it, but I will say that there is a potential, if we do what we have set out to do and the systems of record deliver against their promises, I think there could be with provider groups, you've probably always heard, allow a provider to function at the top of their license. I believe with every role and every function in healthcare, you should allow an individual to function at the top of their license. So for example, even if you're in revenue cycle, you want to remove a lot of the rote tasks that are unfortunately bogging down somebody who is a specialist in South Carolina Medicaid to allow them to only handle the really tough processes. Even with prior authorizations, we don't completely remove the human from the equation. We just reduce the number of tasks that show up on a human work list. So I think we're in this evolution period of, and that's why I said augmented intelligence and a sidekick and a digital workforce working with the human workforce rather than completely saying a digital workforce is going to take over.
And just to add to that more generally, I think that's a great way of framing it. Like, relevant to the AWS for Health initiative, a lot of what we're seeing trend-wise is hospitals, health systems have made these big purchases because they were mandated to do so in a lot of cases, and now they have it. And so what they want to do is get more value out of that system with additional products, service lines, et cetera. And so the discussion I've seen at least is shifting to, we've done this, we're making, this is great, or we're making it work, and can we do more? So what other services, what other features can we add to that? So that's one of the nice things about packaging things together in solutions and bringing them to those customers.
There's a gentleman in the back, and then we'll come to you.
Does Olive partner with EMR, EHR providers to kind of enhance the right capabilities for long-term food automation, but using REST APIs or other standard
Partner.
We should repeat that just for
Yeah, sorry. The question that was asked is, does Olive partner with EMR, EHR systems to allow and force the conversation for write back so you're not dependent on GUI-based UI RPA? Yes, we do a lot of partnership. So for example, actually all of our contracts that are written are three-way agreements between us, the customer, and the system of record, whether the record is an ERP system or it could be Epic, Cerner, whatever it might be. I think we're getting to a point, us as a company and just an N of one of Olive, where we're our brand is well established and the EMRs are less fearful of the things that we do. We have no intention to brute force things, but we are laser committed to solving the human burnout issue, right? So we will constantly run into roadblocks, don't get me wrong, on not being able to write back through traditional APIs, where we will fall back on RPA-based writebacks, for example, work queue, sorting, prioritization of lists. There's just no APIs, and FHIR doesn't have a standard to force that. And an EMR company today is likely not going to invest in a proprietary API framework because they're going to stick to the bare baseline, which is FHIR, right? So we have pretty close relationship with our EMR counterparts and work with them closely, but it's a slug. It will continue to be. There's a question. So the question that was asked is, how dependent are we on practice management systems to get data? The dependency isn't so much on the practice management system. The dependency is on the workflow that you're looking to hand off to Olive. So if the workflow involves a revenue cycle process, or maybe a patient access process where the scheduling is being done in a traditional practice management system, then you have a dependency on getting data, either in the form of Olive having access to that system or Olive having access to the APIs. I will say practice management systems are, HL7 2.6 and 7 have not changed since the middle 90s. So an SIU feed and an ADT feed are pretty ubiquitous today. So it would be a real unfortunate situation if a practice management system can't give you a scheduling output and a demographic output, right? That standard has not changed in decades. Yeah, so the follow-up question was, it still continues to be a challenge with smaller groups, and that's where you use UI-based RPA. In that 4-pillar model, a robotic process automation traditional process can be easily done through a learning object that gets deployed on a smaller provider's EMR system, right? So I think you're only limited by how the system is architected and where it's run, right? So if it's run in a Citrix environment, it makes things a little bit more complex. If it runs natively in a browser, it makes things a lot easier. So where there's a will, there's a way. Other...
Are you doing anything to eliminate redundancies or errors in the processes instead of automating them?
Yeah, great question, so I'll repeat it. Are you doing anything to eliminate redundancy or in a process, or are you just automating a process? I think it's an evolution of an automation journey. Initially, to start off with, you will take an existing process and you will automate it because people are pretty passionate about the process that they have implemented. Few will start to tell you that the process itself is really wrong and we should challenge the very status quo of the process. The evolution of the automation is you first take on the process the way it is. It will automatically remove redundancy because it's being automated by something other than a human. And then over a period of time, so at Olive, we have a couple metrics that we constantly display to our customer. One of them is called human power. And so similar to horsepower, we do a conversion of how much value a single AI worker is providing to a system when compared against a human output. And so you're taking away that redundancy because you're applying it towards this human power metric. The other one that we do is we generate something called a Olive human message and a supporting beacon. So what Olive will do is over a period of time after that task runs, it will send messages to the supervisor in that department to say, over the last 30 days, not only have I automated this process, but I've actually optimized it, right? So I have, for example, we do something, our bots will actually self-heal. Another metric we have is sick days. How many days did Olive call in sick for her job, right? And the sick day is, an insurance company changed their portal. They changed a CSS pointer, or they changed a style sheet, or whatever it might be. We've embedded AI to recognize those changes, and we will self-heal the bot to actually perform that task. So the sick day count continues to reduce. And that's the investment we continue to put into the platform. Yeah, great question. So the question that was asked was, most RPA systems, or I will elevate and say an RPA program, will have metrics that you will constantly look at. And those metrics are what tasks are currently automated, what tasks are being evaluated, and what tasks are on, it's almost like if you had a Kanban, what's on the backlog to be evaluated. We do the exact same thing. We have a product offering and a feature offering called Apertures. Apertures is the language in which Olive communicates. She has a visual language, she will now have a voice language, and eventually at some point she might have a tactile way of communicating. Her visual language is, we have an aperture that presents all of the tasks that Olive is taking on, mapped to a particular department, all of the tasks that Olive is currently refining, i.e. building or learning, and all of the tasks that is on deck for Olive to evaluate. With every one of our customers, we establish something called a governance committee, and it's an interdisciplinary team, very similar to like if a hospital system was doing interdisciplinary rounds. I'm rounding on a patient, I have a hospitalist, I have a PT, OT, pharmacist, et cetera, et cetera. We bring this governance committee together, and they're constantly evaluating a process that could be handled by Olive or a process that is being recommended by Olive to look at. Because Olive is constantly learning. How far, did you say? Can you follow it up with, like, how would you define far? Oh, got it. Got it. Okay. So the question was, with our most advanced customers, how far have we come, and give me some examples of tasks that Olive has taken on. So I'll say this pretty lightly, but tasks are typically looked at as low-hanging fruit. But what might be low-hanging fruit for one customer is not a low-hanging fruit for another customer because of how much might be already outsourced versus how much is in-house. So for our most advanced customers at any given period of time, for example, we have a health system in the large Atlantic region that has been automating over 36 different tasks, end-to-end tasks that that's just been handed to Olive. There are other systems who have factored in Olive as being a part of their system when they do budget planning. So when they go in to have linear growth associated with either the population in that region or the expected amount of growth to the health system, they say how much of it is going to be covered by us having a digital workforce, right? And so those tasks typically end up being, if you were to ask me, mostly around operational and revenue cycle management. But we wrote a case study with Wellforce and Tufts where the largest testing facility in the entire state of Massachusetts for COVID, we improved their performance just on testing by 700%. Because they had a Salesforce portal that did registration, they had a Siemens system that did the actual capture, and they did a point of service system that was completely different. And so they had nurses that were mostly spending the nurses that were doing the tests, mostly spending their time doing the registration. We said, Olive could just manage that for you. And so we actually have photos of our team walking around, and the testing facility had people all around the block, and then after Olive went live, you just see this like just massive circle of people just going through because it's in the background, right? And it's not a revenue cycle process, it was a registration process. So it really depends on the appetite, the risk appetite, and the automation appetite of a system to take on.
Any other
All right.
questions? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thanks again, Rohan. Of
course.
For,
Thank you.
for explaining that as well.